June 23, 1942. The afternoon sun hung low over the English Channel, painting the waters below in shades of gold and copper. High above the coastline, at 15,000 feet, Oberleutnant Armin Faber pushed his Focke-Wulf 190 through the cloud layers, his mind already composing the combat report he would file when he landed. 3 Spitfires engaged. 1 confirmed kill. Possibly 2. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. His fuel gauge showed the reserves dwindling. Emergency landing at the nearest friendly airfield per standard protocol. This was routine. This was how the air war worked. Patrol the channel. Engage enemy fighters when opportunity presented. Return home when fuel ran low. Faber had done it dozens of times. He was a good pilot, skilled, experienced, with a solid combat record. He'd survived this long by being careful, by understanding his aircraft, by making sound tactical decisions in the chaos of aerial combat. The disorientation came gradually. After emerging from the cloud cover following his combat with the Spitfires, Faber had expected to see the familiar coastline of France stretched below him. The geography should have been unmistakable. He'd flown this route numerous times. He knew the shape of the beaches, the river mouths, the distinctive landmarks that marked German-held territory. But something felt off. The coastline below did look familiar, but not quite right. Still, the heading seemed correct. His instruments indicated he was flying south-southwest, back toward France. The fuel situation was critical. He needed to land soon. Faber made the decision that would change the course of the air war. He descended toward what he believed to be a German airfield. The reality was far different. Faber had misread every landmark. The clouds had disoriented him more thoroughly than he realized. The coastline below that looked similar to northern France was actually South Wales. The heading that felt correct was taking him deeper into enemy territory. The familiar geography was actually completely foreign. In the confusion of combat and the disorientation of cloud cover, Faber had become turned around. He was flying north into England when he believed he was flying south toward France. At RAF Pembrey, the observation tower overlooked a quiet coastal airfield that had seen its share of wartime action, but nothing particularly dramatic that June afternoon. Flight Sergeant Jeffries stood with binoculars raised, scanning the sky out of habit more than urgency. The morning patrol had returned hours ago. No raids were expected. The afternoon was proving uneventful. Just another quiet day in a war that had momentarily moved elsewhere. Then he saw it. A single aircraft inbound from the south, descending at a steady angle, approaching with confidence and purpose. Jeffries tracked the aircraft through his binoculars, noting its approach angle and flight characteristics. Something felt wrong. Not threatening exactly, but distinctly wrong. The aircraft was moving too fast, handling with too much aggression, displaying maneuvers that seemed almost arrogant in their precision. This wasn't a British aircraft. Jeffries was certain of it. "Sir," he called to the duty officer, "we've got an incoming. Single aircraft, unidentified." The duty officer grabbed his own binoculars. Both men watched in tense silence as the aircraft continued its approach. No evasive maneuvers, no combat flying. Just a clean, confident descent like a pilot returning home after a routine milk run. The silhouette resolved into something they'd seen before. Many times before. But always at a distance. Always in combat. Always as a threat. Never like this. Never landing at their airfield. The duty officer's voice went quiet and steady, controlled despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. "That's a Focke-Wulf." For a moment, neither man moved. The standard procedure was obvious. Sound the alarm, scramble fighters, attempt to shoot down the intruder. But the FW-190 was already in its landing pattern. Gear down. Flaps extended. The universal signal of peaceful intent from a pilot who believed he was landing at a friendly base. And more importantly, it was about to hand them something British intelligence had been desperately trying to acquire for almost a year. An intact example of Germany's most lethal fighter aircraft. "Don't shoot," the duty officer commanded. "Let him land. Get everyone to the runway. Now." The word spread through the airfield like electricity through a circuit. Ground crews dropped their tools mid-repair. Pilots sprinted from the mess hall, abandoning their lunch. Service personnel emerged from buildings and hangars. Everyone who could move converged on the runway to witness something that shouldn't be happening. A Luftwaffe fighter, Germany's most advanced, settling onto British concrete as casually as if it were landing at Regensburg or any other German home base. Faber's landing was textbook perfect. Smooth touchdown, controlled rollout. The wheels kissed the tarmac with barely a whisper. He taxied toward what he assumed were friendly positions, his mind already composing the detailed report he would file about the brief combat engagement over the channel. His heart rate was elevated from the adrenaline of combat, but he felt the satisfaction of a successful mission. 3 kills. A safe return. All in a day's work for a Luftwaffe pilot. He shut down the engine. The sudden silence felt wrong. Too quiet. No familiar sounds of a German airbase. No voices shouting in German. No mechanics running toward him with fuel and ammunition trucks. Just an eerie stillness that made his skin prickle with the first whisper of wrongness. Something was deeply amiss. Faber released his harness and pushed himself up in the cockpit, preparing to climb down from his fighter. That's when his world inverted completely. The uniforms were wrong. RAF blue instead of Luftwaffe gray. The aircraft visible across the airfield were wrong. Spitfires and other British fighters, not German bombers and transports. The faces staring at him from 30 yards away were the faces of the enemy. He'd studied those uniforms in recognition training. Those were unmistakably British soldiers and RAF personnel, and they were converging on his aircraft with rifles raised and weapons ready. His hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, a pistol that suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. But what was the point? He was surrounded by an entire British airfield. His fighter was already captured. The mistake was already made. There was no escape, no heroic last stand, no tactical solution to the catastrophic error he'd just committed. Faber's mind raced backward through his flight, reviewing every decision, every assumption, every navigational choice that had led to this moment. The combat over the channel, that had been real enough. The disorientation after his kills. That was the beginning of the problem. The clouds that had obscured his view. He'd emerged from cloud cover assuming he'd drifted east toward France. The coastline below had looked right. The heading had felt correct, but he'd been completely turned around. The geography of Wales and northern France near Brest looked deceptively similar from altitude. Similar coastlines. Similar terrain formations. Similar patterns of towns and rivers and fields. He'd misread every landmark, made every wrong assumption, drew every incorrect conclusion, and flown north into England when he thought he was flying south into friendly territory. A simple navigation error. The kind of mistake that could happen to any pilot. But it had happened at the worst possible moment. With the worst possible aircraft. In the worst possible circumstances. The British soldiers reached his aircraft. Rifles raised. Voices shouting orders in crisp English. Faber raised his hands and climbed down from the cockpit of what was now the most valuable intelligence prize in the entire European theater of war. For 11 months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been the terror of European skies. The aircraft had entered service in August 1941, and from its very first combat missions, it had dominated the air war with a superiority that seemed almost invincible. RAF Spitfire pilots, the legendary men who'd won the Battle of Britain just a year earlier, suddenly found themselves outclassed by a German fighter that appeared to do everything better, faster, more efficiently. It was faster in level flight, achieving speeds that left British fighters struggling to keep up. It rolled faster than anything the Allies flew, executing maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. It could dive away from trouble with startling acceleration and climb back to altitude before British fighters could pursue. Its armament, 4 machine guns and 2 powerful 20mm cannons, could shred a Spitfire in a single devastating burst of fire. Worst of all, it seemed to absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft and somehow keep flying, limping home with battle damage that should have sent it spiraling into the sea. British pilots filed report after report describing this new German fighter, their words carrying a mixture of professional assessment and barely concealed fear. The aircraft was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Intelligence officers compiled the data, trying to construct a coherent picture of the enemy's capabilities and tactical employment. But all they had to work with were fragments. Combat assessments made during desperate maneuvers at high speed. Observations of wreckage from crashed aircraft scattered across the fields of England and France. Blurry reconnaissance photographs taken at high altitude of FW-190s parked on distant airfields. Nothing definitive. Nothing comprehensive. Nothing that explained exactly how the Germans had engineered a fighter that suddenly dominated the air war so completely. The Spitfire Mark V, the RAF's frontline fighter and the pride of the service, couldn't match the FW-190. British test pilots flew captured German aircraft when they could get them, primarily Messerschmitt 109s, and recommended tactical counters and defensive maneuvers. But the FW-190 was different. It fought differently. It used different tactics. It maneuvered differently. It had different strengths and weaknesses. And most frustratingly, the RAF had no intact example to study, no way to understand its construction, no method to discover its weaknesses, no systematic approach to develop effective tactical counters. Air Ministry officials and aircraft designers understood they needed to build better fighters. The Spitfire Mark IX was in development, showing promise in preliminary designs. The Hawker Typhoon was entering service, though it had its own development problems. But without understanding exactly what made the FW-190 so lethal, without comprehending its design philosophy and engineering approach, British engineers were designing new fighters in darkness, guessing at solutions to problems they couldn't fully define or understand. Morale among RAF pilots suffered. How could you fight effectively against an enemy you didn't understand? How could you develop defensive tactics against an aircraft whose capabilities remained mysterious? The FW-190 seemed invincible, an aircraft without weaknesses or limitations. Every encounter with it was a desperate struggle, and victory was never certain. Then Oberleutnant Armin Faber's navigation error delivered the solution directly into their hands. Within an hour of his landing at RAF Pembrey, the FW-190 was surrounded by armed guards and covered with protective tarps. No one outside the airfield could know what had just fallen into British hands. The secrecy was absolute and essential. If German intelligence learned that the British had captured an intact FW-190, they would immediately change tactics, modify procedures, and potentially create new aircraft to counter whatever advantages the British might gain from studying it. By evening, a recovery team from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough had arrived at the airfield to transport the fighter to the secure testing facility where Britain evaluated all captured enemy aircraft. The FW-190 was carefully loaded onto transport vehicles, still covered, still secret. By early morning, the aircraft sat in a climate-controlled hangar at Farnborough, surrounded by engineers, designers, test pilots, and intelligence officers who couldn't quite believe their extraordinary luck. The work began immediately. They photographed everything, measured everything, documented every detail of the aircraft's construction with meticulous precision, from the massive BMW 801 radial engine to its electrical systems, to the ergonomic layout of its cockpit and controls. The technical intelligence alone was worth 100 combat reports compiled from pilot debriefings, but the real value, the true treasure, would come from flight testing, from putting experienced British pilots in the cockpit and discovering exactly what this aircraft could do and, more importantly, what it couldn't do. Captain Eric Brown, one of the Royal Navy's most accomplished and experienced test pilots, received the assignment. He'd flown more types of aircraft than almost anyone alive. He'd tested captured German planes before and understood the unique challenges of flying unfamiliar enemy-designed aircraft. But the FW-190 was different, special. From the moment he climbed into the cockpit and settled himself into the unfamiliar seat, he knew this was something extraordinary. The first flight test produced data that sent shockwaves through the RAF hierarchy. Brown described an aircraft with performance that exceeded the worst fears of British intelligence. The FW-190's roll rate was extraordinary. It could reverse direction and change heading faster than any Allied fighter in existence. Its controls remained responsive and precise at very high speeds, where Spitfires became increasingly heavy, sluggish, and difficult to maneuver. The radial engine provided massive, continuous power at low altitude, exactly where most dogfights occurred, where pilots fought for survival in three-dimensional maneuvers. But most significantly, Captain Brown's extensive testing revealed the weaknesses. critical limitations that had not been apparent from combat observation alone. The FW-190's performance degraded markedly above 20,000 feet, where its radial engine became less efficient. Its rate of climb couldn't match a properly flown Spitfire. The aircraft was optimized for combat at low and medium altitudes. Most crucially, Brown identified a fundamental tactical error that RAF pilots had been making consistently. They'd been trying to turn with the FW-190, engaging it in the turning fights where the German fighter excelled. This was exactly what Luftwaffe pilots wanted. They had the advantage in turning engagements. Brown's comprehensive report outlined new tactical doctrines. Force the fight to high altitude where the Spitfire could perform better, avoid turning engagements where the FW-190 was superior, use the Spitfire's superior climb rate to gain altitude advantage, maintain speed and use Spitfire's diving characteristics where possible, never try to outdive an FW-190 or outturn it in a slow-speed engagement. The captured aircraft revealed why the FW-190 was so effective, why it had dominated the European skies so completely. While British and American engineers had obsessed over inline liquid-cooled engines, the elegant Rolls-Royce Merlin that powered the Spitfire, the powerful Packard-built variants, the Allison engines in American fighters, Germany's brilliant designer Kurt Tank had chosen a radically different approach. Tank had wrapped an entire fighter around a massive BMW 801 radial engine, a choice that seemed counterintuitive to every principle of modern aircraft design. Radial engines were bulky, creating massive drag and weight penalties. Everyone in the aviation world knew that inline engines represented the future of high-speed aviation. Radial engines belonged to an earlier generation of aircraft, to biplanes and slow transports, not to modern fighters. But Kurt Tank had made it work. Brilliantly. The BMW 801 produced 2,100 horsepower in a package that proved remarkably reliable and surprisingly aerodynamic. Tank's engineers had designed a remarkably tight cowling that minimized drag while providing excellent cooling of the radial engine cylinders. The radial configuration meant the engine could absorb battle damage that would destroy an inline engine. Bullets could pass through individual cylinders without hitting the coolant systems or other critical components that were vulnerable on liquid-cooled engines. An FW-190 could limp home with half its cylinders shot out, something a Spitfire with its vulnerable Rolls-Royce Merlin could never do. British engineers studying the captured fighter realized they'd been fundamentally wrong about radial engines. The performance data didn't lie. It was objective and mathematical. At altitudes below 20,000 feet, the FW-190 outperformed everything the Allies flew. Germany hadn't made a compromise in choosing a radial engine. They'd made a calculated, brilliant engineering decision that gave them a significant combat advantage in the altitude bands where most aerial combat occurred. The FW-190's armament layout revealed another German innovation that impressed British designers. 4 MG-17 machine guns mounted in the fuselage, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, providing rapid-fire capability. 2 MG-151-20 cannons mounted in the wing roots, providing explosive power. The combination provided devastating firepower with minimal weight penalty and no ammunition feed problems or convergence issues. British fighters typically mounted all weapons in the wings, creating complex convergence angles where the pilot had to calculate the range at which the bullet streams intersected. The FW-190's centralized firepower meant every bullet and every cannon shell followed exactly the pilot's line of sight. The advantage was subtle, but real. Then there was the flight control system itself. Kurt Tank had obsessed over pilot workload and ergonomics, designing an aircraft that managed many complex systems automatically. The propeller pitch, fuel mixture, and engine boost pressure adjusted automatically as the pilot changed throttle settings. The cowl flaps opened and closed automatically to maintain optimal engine temperature. The pilot didn't have to manually manage a dozen different parameters in combat. In combat, where split-second decisions meant survival or death, the FW-190 pilot could focus entirely on fighting, on tactical maneuvering, on weapon deployment, while his aircraft managed its own systems transparently. British designers took extensive notes. They documented everything they discovered. The lessons learned from studying Faber's captured FW-190 influenced every subsequent British fighter design. The Hawker Tempest incorporated improved roll rates and better high-speed handling characteristics. Later marks of the Spitfire received stronger ailerons and more refined control systems. American designers received the detailed intelligence data too, and these findings influenced the development of fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the development of later variants of the P-51 Mustang. Perhaps the most immediate and dramatic impact was tactical. Within weeks of the FW-190's capture and comprehensive testing, RAF squadrons received detailed, classified briefing documents explaining exactly how to fight Germany's most dangerous fighter. The documents were marked top secret. They outlined every weakness Captain Brown had discovered through exhaustive testing. Every limitation, every tactical error Luftwaffe pilots consistently made. Every method British pilots could employ to negate the FW-190's considerable advantages. The intelligence did something profoundly important beyond tactical doctrine. It restored confidence. For 11 months, RAF pilots had faced an aircraft that seemed invincible, an opponent without apparent weaknesses. Morale had suffered under the constant pressure of fighting an apparently superior enemy. Now they understood their opponent. They knew its capabilities. They understood its limitations. They knew it could be beaten. The psychological impact of this understanding matched the tactical value of the information. The air war over Europe began to shift noticeably. British pilots flying the same Spitfire Mark Verses that had been slaughtered by FW-190s suddenly started winning engagements. Not because their aircraft had improved, the Spitfires were the same aircraft they'd been flying for months, but because they understood how to fight. They forced combats to high altitude where the FW-190 struggled. They used their superior rate of climb to gain position advantage. They avoided the rolling scissors maneuvers where the German fighter excelled. They refused to be drawn into the slow-speed turning fights where the FW-190 had dominant advantage. German pilots noticed the change immediately and with growing concern. The RAF had learned something important. The easy kills disappeared. British formations suddenly adopted formations specifically designed to counter the FW-190's strengths. Luftwaffe combat reports began describing encounters where Spitfires fought with unexpected effectiveness and efficiency, using maneuvers and tactics that seemed specifically designed to negate German advantages. The Luftwaffe command couldn't understand what had changed. Their aircraft hadn't changed. The pilots were the same experienced veterans who'd been winning consistently for months. But something fundamental had shifted. They never knew why. The British kept the captured FW-190 secret, testing it extensively and rigorously, but never allowing word to leak that they possessed an intact example. German intelligence suspected the Allies had captured FW-190s from crash sites and wreckage, but they never knew about Faber's pristine gift. They never knew that every tactical adjustment, every British countermove, every new RAF fighting technique came from exhaustive analysis and testing of a perfectly preserved fighter delivered by a pilot who thought he was landing in France. Oberleutnant Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in POW camps. British intelligence interrogated him extensively, trying to extract every detail about the FW-190's capabilities, operational procedures, tactical employment, and any intelligence he might possess. But Faber, bound by military honor and German regulations governing prisoners, provided only name, rank, and serial number. He was professionally courteous, but completely non-cooperative. He never knew that his aircraft had already told the British everything they needed to know. Other German pilots heard rumors. Stories circulated through Luftwaffe squadrons about a pilot who'd landed in England by mistake. The details remained vague. Wartime propaganda couldn't be trusted, and the story seemed too extraordinary to be credible. But the story persisted in hangar discussions and pilot briefings. A navigation error, an intact FW-190. British hands. For German pilots, the story carried elements of tragedy and dark humor. Kurt Tank, the FW-190's brilliant designer, reportedly exploded in rage when he learned what had happened. Years of careful development, thousands of hours of engineering work, countless design iterations and refinements. Every tactical advantage his fighter provided, all compromised by one pilot's navigation mistake. The most valuable parts of his life's work, handed to the enemy on a silver platter. The war continued. The FW-190 remained a formidable fighter. German pilots still achieved victories flying it. The aircraft continued to inspire respect and fear among Allied pilots. But the overwhelming superiority it had enjoyed from August 1941 to June 1942 evaporated almost immediately after Faber's capture. The tactical balance shifted fundamentally. Allied pilots understood their opponent and adjusted accordingly. The FW-190 became just another enemy fighter, dangerous, respected, worthy of caution, but no longer the invincible killer that had terrorized the skies. Germany introduced improved variants in an attempt to recapture the advantage. The FW-190D series with its inline Junkers Jumo engine, designed for higher altitude performance. The high-altitude TA-152. Each variant represented desperate attempts to recapture the advantage they'd lost. But the Allies had learned the fundamental lessons. They understood German design philosophy. They knew how to counter radial engine fighters. They'd incorporated the intelligence into their own aircraft development programs. After the war ended in 1945, Faber returned to Germany. He lived quietly, spending his remaining years without fanfare or prominence, rarely speaking about his wartime service. Fellow Luftwaffe veterans treated him with a complex mixture of sympathy and contempt. His skill as a pilot was never questioned. His combat record before the incident was solid and respectable. But the navigation error haunted him. In a war where every advantage mattered desperately, where thousands of lives hung on technical superiority, where inches and seconds determined survival, he'd handed the enemy their greatest intelligence prize. Historians have debated the impact of Faber's mistake for decades. Some argue it accelerated Allied victory in the air war by several months. Others suggest the tactical adjustments would have emerged eventually through accumulated combat experience and systematic analysis of captured wreckage. But the timing was significant. June 1942 marked a critical turning point in the air war. Allied fighter production was accelerating rapidly. American fighters were arriving in Europe in increasing numbers. The FW-190's window of absolute superiority was already beginning to close. But what Faber's error did was slam that window shut immediately. Instead of months of continued German air superiority, while Allied pilots slowly learned through bloody experience and costly trial and error how to counter the FW-190, the British gained instant, comprehensive understanding. Every RAF pilot received the benefit of systematic test flight analysis conducted by expert test pilots, instead of having to learn through trial and fatal error in combat against a superior opponent. The captured FW-190 flew at Farnborough for years, serving multiple purposes. British test pilots used it to train new pilots in enemy aircraft recognition and tactics. Engineers studied its construction techniques and manufacturing methods. Designers examined its innovations and design philosophy. Even after the war ended, the aircraft remained valuable as a reference point, as a benchmark of what German engineering had achieved under wartime pressure. Today, the FW-190 that landed at RAF Pembrey on June 23, 1942, sits in the Royal Air Force Museum, restored with meticulous care and preserved as a national treasure. Visitors can walk around it, admiring its compact, purposeful design, its powerful radial engine, the 4 machine guns and 2 cannons that made it so lethal. Most visitors don't know the full story. The placard mentions it was captured during the war. There are a few words about the circumstances. Nothing about the impact on Allied fighter tactics. Nothing about how one pilot's confusion handed Britain the key to countering Germany's most dangerous fighter. But the veterans knew. The pilots who flew against FW-190s before and after June 1942 understood exactly what Faber's mistake had meant. The British test pilots who wrung out the captured fighters' every capability, who wrote the tactical documents that saved Allied lives, they knew the immeasurable value of what had landed in Wales that afternoon. And somewhere in Germany, until his death in 1976, Armin Faber knew too. He carried the knowledge throughout his remaining decades of what his navigation error had cost. Not just the loss of his aircraft or his freedom as a POW, but the intelligence advantage, the tactical surprise, the margin of superiority that might have extended German air dominance for months more. The incident reveals something fundamental about modern warfare that remains relevant today. Technology alone doesn't guarantee victory. The FW-190 was a magnificent aircraft, arguably the best fighter in the world when it entered service. But advantages can be fragile. intelligence can negate superiority. Understanding your opponent's capabilities matters as much as having superior capabilities yourself. It also demonstrates the power of individual actions in large-scale conflict. Millions of men fought in World War II. Thousands of aircraft engaged in aerial combat. But one pilot, making one navigation error, on one June afternoon, changed the dynamics of the air war. History pivoted on mistakes as often as it pivoted on heroism. One aircraft. One pilot. One navigation error. And the course of the air war changed. That's the power of individual actions in conflict. That's the fragility of technological advantage. That's the story of the day. Germany's most lethal weapon was accidentally delivered to the enemy by a pilot who thought he was going home.